Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Maddie Chang, and as Sammy mentioned, I'm a policy advisor at the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, which is an expert advisory body to the UK government. We advise on all things related to data-driven technology. And today we're here to talk about the use of AI in recruitment. The use of AI to make important decisions about people and to decide who gets what in society is certainly becoming more widespread across sectors. And in recruitment specifically, both the promise of this technology and the risks of harm are especially tangible and clear. On the one hand, regular hiring can be inefficient and rife with bias, so it seems natural to want to use technology to improve the status quo. On the other hand, using data-driven tools can actually exacerbate existing bias and introduce new forms of unfairness. I actually saw a tweet yesterday from New America that said, "Digitizing a broken process gets you a digitized broken process." In the panel today, I hope to explore the extent to which that's happening in AI when used in recruitment, and also want to explore where the opportunities for innovation lie. Throughout, how do we apply principles like fairness and transparency in day-to-day practice? And the stakes of getting this right are really high. Getting a job is a key part of who we are and is a key step to social mobility. So without further ado, I'm going to ask all the panelists to come on in and ask everyone to introduce themselves. Thank you all so much for being here today. It's lovely to see you, virtually albeit. I will begin with Mary, and then you can go ahead and pass the mic to the other panelists. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Mary.
Thanks, Maddie. So I'd like to start by saying a huge thank you to the CDEI for convening this panel discussion, and it's great to have the opportunity to share the work of perspective with the CogX audience. So my name's Mary Towers. I'm an employment rights policy officer at the TUC, and the TUC brings together more than 5.5 million working people who belong to our 48 member unions. And our role is to support trade unions and to represent the interests of working people. For the past year and a half, I've been leading on a project at the TUC looking at the use of AI to recruit and manage people at work. And to support that project, we formed a union working group. We carried out a survey of workers and trade union reps and commissioned polling with a view to identifying the different types of technologies being used to recruit and manage people at work, the extent to which they were being used across the different stages of the employment relationship, and crucially, the impact of these technologies on workers. And since then, we've published our research findings, commissioned a legal report from employment and AI lawyers Robin Allen QC and D Masters at Cloisters. That was published in March this year alongside a TUC manifesto for change that's called Dignity at Work and the AI Revolution, that I hope to tell you all a bit more about in this session. And really excitingly, CogX recognised the TUC's AI project by shortlisting us for an award this year alongside Robin Allen QC and D Masters. And it's been really fantastic to see other union colleagues taking part in the festival this week. And so I'd like to close this introduction just by acknowledging the really great efforts of the CogX team to give civil society and especially workers a strong voice at this year's CogX festival.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's great to have you here today. I might ask Neil to go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Maddie. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here at CogX today. My name's Neil Carberry. I'm Chief Executive of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, which is the UK's trade body for recruitment firms, but we're also the professional body, so standards has always been really important to us, and we're pleased to have been working with CDEI over the last year and a half or so on the question of ethics and the use of data in recruitment. My background's in HR. I sit on the council of ACAS, and I'm just about to finish a 7-year term on the Low Pay Commission looking at pay setting here in the UK. So I'm fascinated by how technology can transform what we do, but do it with a purpose, which, as we talk about at the REC, is about making great work happen, helping businesses to grow and opening up opportunities for people and avoiding some of that translation of a broken process into a broken digital process, Maddie, that you began with.
Great. Thank you so much, Neil. Great to have you here today. And finally, Jeremias, if I can ask you to introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you very much indeed for the invitation. I'm Jeremias Adams-Prassl. I'm a professor of law at the University of Oxford, and my background is very much in employment law. I've been working on different ways in which digitalization and technology reshape the future of work for the last 10 years or so. My most recent book on this was called Humans as a Service, the promise and peril of working in the gig economy, where I very much explored some of the themes we're thinking about today, the automation of traditional management functions in the context of the gig economy. But since the start of this year, I've been leading a big research program here at Oxford University, bringing together computer scientists, social scientists, and lawyers to think about what happens when automation comes for management jobs. Everybody talks about what happens when automation comes for workers' jobs and we will lose our jobs. There's a lot less focus so far on what happens when lots of the traditional management functions are starting to be replaced. And whilst initially it might sound very promising, this idea that your boss is losing her job, well, actually it turns out that an algorithm can potentially be much worse. But it can also be better, and that's what I'm looking forward to discussing with all of you today.
Thank you so much, Jeremias. It's great to have all of your perspectives in the room today, from legal academia to trade unions to industry bodies. So thank you so much again for being here. Just to get the ball rolling on questions, I'm going to ask a softball, which is, where do you see the greatest risks and opportunities considering the uses of algorithms in hiring or in recruitment more broadly? I'm going to ask Neil to start on this question. Go for it, Neil.
Thanks, Maddie. I think I'll answer from the perspective of a business and HR team that are looking at all of this. I think the opportunities are fairly obvious in terms of speed of processing, large amounts of data, and getting down to focusing human beings' attention on the critical decisions that need to be made in hiring. So initially, a lot of it is about what can we do in selection, and both with looking at applications and at CVs, and what can we do in targeting and what we call resourcing in the industry, in terms of where we go based on what we've seen of candidates to find those who might be interested in roles, and then what we do in selection once we get people into the processes. There is actually quite substantial room for efficiency gain there. An example not on the AI side, but if you look at blockchain skills credentialing, that will be hugely time saving for the industry as we move towards it. So huge opportunities there. I think the risks are a little bit more subtle. And I think from the HR directors I talk to, what's on their mind is how can we make this sustainable for the long term? And forgive me, I am a history graduate by original degree, so I'm going to throw this in.
Same, actually, so no worries.
Well, in two of the greatest crises of the 20th century, in 1919 in the Treaty of Versailles and in 1944 in the Declaration of Philadelphia, the nations of the world came together and made one declaration, which is labor is not a commodity. And I think that's really important, which is the big risk, and my members see it actually day to day with companies, and the difference is whether you think recruitment is a process of procurement or whether it's a process of human interaction. And I think it's really important for HR teams to see it as a process of human interaction. And I think for businesses internally and with recruitment firms, the big debate is going to be, how do we make sure that we are doing things which aren't just short-term, more efficient and more commercially beneficial, but actually live our values for the long term and help us to grow the team that will make us more commercially successful for the long term. Now, that's a tough discussion to have, but it starts actually with having the digital natives on your team in a company to know what you're buying when you buy technology. And that's the biggest single piece of advice that I'd offer any business right now.
Thank you, Neil. Mary or Jeremias, please feel free to jump in here.
Shall I go, Jeremias?
Go ahead.
All right, thank you. It's so great to hear from Neil this sort of concept of kind of putting the human back at the centre of these issues and this debate. So I think what I'd like to do is really highlight two big challenges and then a really important area of opportunity that we see for workers and unions. So in terms of the first challenge, tying in with Neil's point about human value, so we want to ensure that technology at work works for everyone, not just employers and commercial interests. So we say that workers' needs and interests should be at the heart of any development, procurement and application of AI powered tools to recruit and manage people at work. And meeting this challenge is one of the key motivations behind the TUC's AI project. And we believe that this can be achieved by investigating and understanding the lived worker experience of these technologies, raising awareness of that experience, which must involve education, training and effective communication, and crucially has to involve all of us working together to understand each other's perspective. And then giving workers voice and influence through strong unions, a duty to consult unions before introducing AI at work, that consultation being genuine and strong collective bargaining. And then second big challenge that we perceive is preventing negative impact on people, preventing negative impact on workers. So in our research, we found evidence of negative impacts on workers as a result of the use of data-driven tools in recruitment and management. And those negative impacts included things like, for example, discriminatory impact. So, for example, the discriminatory operation of facial recognition technology that might be marking down disabled applicants in job interviews, and other forms of unfairness, so inequality of access, perhaps with blind applicants being unable to access gamified assessment or training, legitimate absences automatically triggering formal capability procedure, those types of unfairnesses. And then a detrimental impact on health and well-being, which seem to be related to a lack of human agency and the stress of feeling constantly monitored, physical risk due to unreasonable targets, and just a sort of general dehumanizing effect of the technologies. And then also big difficulty actually challenging decisions that are being made by AI because of a lack of transparency, explainability, and consent. So these are really immediate problems that are playing themselves out right now in the workplace. And then in terms of opportunity, we see a huge opportunity for workers and unions in terms of actually harnessing the collective power of data. And so we believe that in this era of data-driven tools, there's a really great opportunity for workers to actually take control of their own data and start benefiting from data-driven tools that are developed to increase fairness and equality of work. So, for example, to undertake pay analysis to secure equal pay, to analyse hours and pay to evidence trade union campaigning for better wages. So we say that workers should have a positive right to what we call data reciprocity, whereby if workers give consent to employers for their workplace data to be used, then they should be given a reciprocal right to collect and combine their own workplace data. And a right like that would go some way to redressing the imbalance of power that currently exists over data between employers and employees, and could also help workers and unions identify where there are discriminatory, unethical, or inaccurate practices that are being carried out by data-driven tools. So we say that the collective nature of trade unions means that they're really uniquely placed to help workers with this collectivization of data.
So I think I agree with a lot of things that both Neil and Mary have said. I think we can all agree in terms of the opportunities, the upsides, that a lot of current recruitment is broken. We employment lawyers will be out of business, in a sense, if there weren't all sorts of issues already in the process. And when you look at some of the opportunities, some of the ways new recruitment systems are being developed, for example, by replacing traditional CV-based scoring with more of a skills or capabilities approach, actually there's a lot of promise here. I think the biggest concern I've got potentially, and what we really need to watch out for, is that we don't take existing biases and hard bake them into these systems. In another sense, and Maddie, I really like this point that you were referencing a tweet earlier, it's really important that we don't just take what's there and automate it, but we actually perhaps take this moment of automation as a real opportunity to rethink the process, to rethink the criteria we're using, to rethink how we evaluate even the things we're doing already. And so I think it's a real moment of opportunity here, even coming out of that risk of saying, let's actually not hard bake all those current problems we've got into new processes, but let's really seize this opportunity to rethink the way we actually select our best workers. Because ultimately, the most diverse talent pool and recruitment going right is in the interests of both workers and employers, right? Nobody has an interest ultimately in recruitment going wrong, in recruitment being biased, or in other ways problematic.
It's a really strong point, Jeremias, that this might be a general opportunity to rethink the way the status quo is working, regardless of AI or with AI. involved. I want to ask everyone, given all of these risks and opportunities that you've articulated so well, where do you currently see the gaps in guidance or otherwise kind of best practice law in addressing some of the challenges that you raised? Where are the holes? One particular example of a hole that comes to mind is how UK-specific employers and purchasers might want to interpret the claims of US-based vendors when it comes to how various AI tools function and where they sit in terms of fairness and transparency. Where do you see gaps, and where is most urgent to address now?
So I think one of the biggest challenges we see, in addition to what you've just raised, Madeleine, which has also, I think, come up in a recent report by the Institute for the Future of Work, I see two major gaps. The first gap I see is the interplay of different regulatory regimes, right? It's really interesting here that when it comes to automating recruitment, we're actually in a world that draws on some very distinct legal regimes. So you've got data protection with the GDPR and the DPA on the one side. You've got employment law with its various duties of the employer on the other. You've got anti-discrimination law with its sort of, own normative superstructure. And really one of the real challenges is that we sort of might end up with little enforcement silos, where actually different enforcement areas, also potentially different enforcement and regulatory bodies, sort of struggle to really communicate with each other. So joint up thinking, both in terms of government and regulators, but also in terms of the different legal areas, will be really, really important. A recent piece by one of my collaborators, Ashley and Kelly Lyth, here in Oxford, in the OGLS, actually has very much pointed out this mismatch, for example, between data protection standards and discrimination law when it comes to recruitment. The other really big challenge is enforcement, and here hiring is particularly tricky. So imagine you've got this watertight right not to be discriminated against for your data to be treated in accordance with the GDPR, but as an individual applicant, how do you actually know? How can you actually be aware of the systems that are being used? It's even more tricky in a sense than when you are already in work and we are subject to automated systems while you're employed, because how do you find out about the other individuals in the groups? How can you potentially even be represented by a trade union before we've yet even begun work? So I think really rethinking how we deal with enforcement of even existing standards we've got is the second big challenge. So interplay between different regulatory regimes, no more silos, and how can we actually enforce this? Because again, I think there's a joint interest between employers and worker representatives here, because enforcement means a level playing field, and actually genuine innovation, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, but genuine innovation needs that level playing field where all actors are held to the same standards.
I think this is a really good point, Jeremias, and it comes back to actually where you were leading it as well, Maddie. I think for me there are a couple of things here that we need to get across. One is, in the days when I took the Underground in London more frequently than the sort of once or twice a week that I currently do. I used to see all these adverts for platform-based labour market matching businesses, and I thought of them and thought, well, that should be covered under the 1973 Employment Agencies Act, and that should be covered. And it's quite easy if you come from a data and AI world to be quite dismissive of that. The kind of self-image of the industry is we're changing the world for the better, and I think largely that is true. But the truth of the matter is that when it comes to people and work, the ability to think broadly about all sorts of workers and all sorts of interests is really important. The most obvious example of that, frankly, is the Uber case that was judged by the Supreme Court recently. It's been running for a couple of years. And one of the things, before I joined the REC, I was the Director of Employment at the CBI for several years. And one of the things I said to everyone was there was a massive debate when that first came to Employment Tribunal and the AT about what the courts would find. I think if you'd asked us at the CBI at that time and Mary's colleagues at the TUC, they were the two places that we were not surprised that Uber drivers were deemed to be workers, because they fairly obviously are. And I think the challenge for technology when it affects people's lives is, I referenced the Treaty of Versailles with a reason earlier. This is built on a cultural structure of protection, and what you're doing in technology might just be speeded up stuff that the system has already thought about, rather than entirely new things. And that requires a bit of thought from the developer side, but particularly coming to your point, Maddie, it requires a lot of thought from the user side. And first and most importantly is, what am I buying, and will this deliver what the vendor says it will deliver? And the only way you can get across that is to understand the product and interrogate the product. So making sure that, one, you're bringing people onto your staff to do it if you're making big investments in this on the hiring side, and recruitment businesses have to as professionals. And all of this is speaking to the fact that I think everyone should use agencies on the basis that we buy all this tech because you don't have to. The challenge in doing that is not just to have the people on your team who understand it. It's exactly Mary's point from a business perspective. It's about the people who are going to be operating this on a daily basis, seeing it and being able to feed back on the sustainability of it. Now, that might just be about whether this actually takes time out or puts time into their business, or it might be the fact that they're best positioned to see some of those baked-in biases if they get a chance to have a look at it.
I think from our perspective, or probably everyone's perspective, the issues are so enormous. And the question is, do we try and deal with everything in a very comprehensive way, which could actually take years for us to do? Or do we start actually looking at what the problems are right now as they're being played out in the workplace and take some urgent action over that to protect workers? So I think what I'd like to do is just tell you a bit, just give you a general idea of the TEC's approach, and then perhaps pick out some specific areas that are of particular relevance to recruitment. So I'm thinking about discrimination and unfairness, transparency and explainability, and human connection and input. So just starting off, just giving you a quick overview of the TEC's approach. What we're saying is that the problems that we face from a union and worker perspective are immediate. So workers are now, in the present moment, living the consequences of technologies being rolled out at work at unprecedented speed and with few controls. And as the problems are immediate, the consequences are significant, then we say, well, urgent action is required. So from a pragmatic trade union perspective, there are two immediate solutions we say available to us. One, that we've got the potential for active consultation and collective bargaining, where we find solutions negotiated together by workers, employers and unions. Plus, we've got the package of proposals that we've put in our manifesto that provide a pragmatic, quick fix to the existing legislative structures that we've got available to us, so to employment law, equality and the data protection framework, and some suggestions for new guidance that can give us all a higher degree of certainty over worker rights and employer obligations. And with the ultimate goal there being a consequent reduction in the need for litigation, which isn't in anyone's interests. And we're saying this is a reasonable, realistic, practical package of reforms that we hope a wide variety of stakeholders could sign up to, and that could, for example, potentially be included in the employment bill. And a package like that to fill the gaps in the existing law and guidance is an essential first step. But I think we all know it's not going to be the end of the road by any means. And I think we all appreciate the enormity of the challenges ahead. The problems and the solutions are multifaceted, but no matter what angle we're looking at the problems from, whether that's development, application, procurement, application, what we're saying is that the worker experience is relevant in terms of finding solutions for each of those stages. And it's going to take a huge effort from all of us working together to find those solutions, sharing our perspectives on these issues. So that's a general point that I'd like to make. And then in terms of our specific proposals, I'm just going to home in on those three areas: discrimination and unfairness, transparency and explainability, and human connection and human input. So in terms of discrimination, we're saying, well, the Equality Act does provide some helpful protection for workers against discriminatory algorithms, but there are significant gaps. And as Jeremias has already touched in, there is a big disconnect between data protection law and equality law. So we're saying, let's just quickly resolve that disconnect by writing into data protection law, writing an express provision that discriminatory data processing is always unlawful. Let's make full use of equality impact audits as part of the data protection impact assessment of AI systems. Let's make that mandatory. Let's tighten up the current protections under the Equality Act. So, for example, let's make sure that all of the actors in the AI value chain can be potentially liable for discrimination, so that we're rooting accountability throughout that value chain. And there's a notable lack of guidance on how employers should avoid discrimination as a result of AI at work in both recruitment and other forms of management at work. And we believe that guidance is urgently required to help employers understand what are the discriminatory risks, what steps can be taken to identify those, how can we avoid those risks. And then in terms of transparency and explainability, so a key finding from our research was that there is a significant lack of transparency and explainability around the use of AI to recruit and manage people. So often workers aren't aware of when these tools are being used, and they just don't know how they're being applied in relation to them as individuals. So to solve that problem, we say there must be new disclosure obligations on employers. For example, a register of workplace AI-powered applications that could be available to both workers and job applicants, and a universal right to explainability of how AI-powered systems are operating, so that people can actually not only access the information about these systems, but for that information to be understandable to your average person. And then in terms of human connection and input, so we started the discussion thinking about the importance of putting humans back into the centre of this debate. So we just want to make sure that rather than working for AI, we're making sure that it's working for us. And to achieve that, we think we need to legislate to protect human connection, human contact, human input into decision making. And so we're saying let's have a universal right of human review of decisions made by technology, and also a positive right to in-person engagement. And so that would mean that, for example, if a job applicant wanted to have an in-person interview, they would actually have a statutory right to meet someone in person for that interview. So those are just a few insights that are specifically relevant to recruitment. We've got a lot of other proposals, and I'd love you all to read our manifesto. Please do. But I'll now hand over back to you, Maddie.
Thanks so much, Mary, and thank you everyone for identifying this overwhelming laundry list of gaps. I would agree on the whole that more guidance would be helpful and is necessary. And as you all know, we are scoping that work now. I promise I did not ask any of you to say that that gap exists, but thank you for saying it nonetheless. In our last question, before we jump to audience Q&A, I just want to get at this question that Neil raised around, okay, what am I buying? How does it work? How do I interrogate it? How should employers, people hoping to use these tools, go about doing that? And specifically, how might an employer compare their existing way of doing things, which, as we all noted, may be imperfect, may have bias itself, to another system, which may also be imperfect, but in potentially different ways? How do you compare those two situations and make the right decision for your organization? I think I may cold call Neil on this question, if you're ready.
Absolutely. I think this is really important, and my sense is that British companies have had a kind of patchy record on technology buy and implementation, and partially it's because so much of it is driven by a cost and efficiency focus run through procurement and IT in the back office, rather than being used as a tool for the front office. So coming back to what I said earlier, for me, a lot of this is driven about which bits of the business you get involved in the interrogation, and about the skills that you bring on. I've spent 15 years talking to C-suite executives in the UK, and uniformly, and I'm sorry to say this to those who are vendors on the call, uniformly the view is that too many technology programs start with a great pitch from a vendor, which then costs a lot of money and doesn't improve performance at the front line, because there was a deeper level of interrogation that needed to happen by a different group of people. So I think Mary's point about voice is really important. I'll leave aside the question of whether you recognise a trade union or not. It's actually more about people being able to play into how you're changing their working lives effectively and doing that. And then the second thing is you've got to have the skills on your own team. Don't have an agency problem. You as a business need to be paying the people who are doing the interrogation and deep diving and asking the tough questions. And I think that's true in large firms, but we've got to remember we've got a small business economy. And if you look at, for instance, some of the work we did when I was at the CBI with colleagues there, looking at the adoption of basic core technologies by UK business, one of the reasons that is not as advanced here as it is in, say, Denmark, is because those skills are not there. So in a tight labour market, those things are going to be really important in terms of getting people in and acknowledging that the people that are going through this system when you're recruiting have choices. I'll finish with my favourite stat of the moment, which is there were 50% more people born in 1964 in the UK than in 1977. You know, we have a tight labour market now. It's going to stay tight for a while. So candidate experience, candidate lived experience and choice is going to make a difference. And if HR and line managers are not feeding into that technology buy process properly, then we'll end up buying stuff that's counterproductive because it will alienate people and it will rule out pools that we desperately need to get involved in our companies.
I think I'd like to build on Neil's point about sort of involving users. If you think about any product in society, you know, there tends to be a sort of process of kind of testing that product on users. And in this particular context, I suppose in a way, we've got two users. We've got the employer and we've got the workers. And so I'm going to return to this point about sort of learning from lived worker experience and taking into account worker voice. So I think workers and unions have to be a key part of evaluation through active consultation. And, you know, historically in future of work collective agreements, for example, you know, unions have negotiated provisions where there's a right to trial. I think worker input is also really important at development stage in terms of testing the algorithms and actually measuring the success. So what is the measure of success for an algorithm? How are algorithms being measured for success? You know, and are the implications for workers being taken, and indeed job applicants, being taken into account by developers at that stage? So I think those are really key issues. And then I've just got a few other thoughts so in terms of existing processes for evaluation, you know, they often seem to be overlooked, but why? You know, there's data protection impact assessments, equality impact assessments, there's a whole sort of ready-made process there that can be used. You know, why not use those? Ethical guidelines and principles, you know, we think are really important. Ethical guidelines that are applicable, you know, across the AI value chain, so from development through to use, application and use. So, for example, we've got a set of values in our manifesto that we ask all employers to take into account when they're considering whether or not to adopt AI to recruit or manage people. And we're also advocating the use of a unified set of ethical guidelines sort of agreed by multi-party stakeholders, including workers and unions. And then I think we've also touched briefly on the importance of the communication of needs between all the parties. So that's between technologists, employers and workers, and effectively communicating, you know, what is the employment relationship? What are the peculiarities of that? What are the needs of that? What are the needs of people, of workers who are living with that technology? And how do those needs get communicated up the chain, you know, through workers, employers, technologists? You know, we need to give people the right language and understanding, and we need to help each other. So we think that collaboration is just so critical over these issues. And then I just want to add in one just quick thought about the importance of what an academic who I was speaking to recently about these issues described to me as the importance of challenging the science fiction narrative. And I do think that that is so important. Like we should actually challenge whether or not it is always appropriate to use technology to make decisions about people at work. This particular academic described to me an algorithm being used to make important decisions about people at work as being equivalent to letting a toddler make those decisions. So let's think really carefully about whether AI will always be better than a human. And on that point, recent guidance from the Office for AI, they published an ethical, sort of 7-point ethical framework for the use of AI in the public sector. And they expressly sort of highlighted that algorithmic decision making is not always the solution to every policy problem. So I just want to really kind of highlight that point because it does often get overlooked. So yeah, just something to reflect on there.
Thank you, Mary. I also saw that guidance in that line bolded at the top. It's great to see. Jeremias, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this question.
Absolutely, I'll try to be very swift. So we have at least one audience question as well. So I think I'd have a very quick sort of, as it were, checklist of things to ask yourself. First of all, what's actually new here? Are you buying something that's better than what you're currently using? What is it doing that's ultimately different? Because that's in the interest, I think, of both the applicants and the recruiters, get the best system and have something better than what you've got in place at the moment. Second, and I think this has already come up, don't necessarily trust the labels. Just because something has a big red sticker on the box saying GDPR compliant, go talk to your in-house lawyers or maybe with external counsel to work out whether actually what you're deploying genuinely is GDPR compliant. Also, I think it's really important that we distinguish between different systems, right? So far, we've been talking about AI recruitment or recruitment software as a sort of, one quite homogeneous set of questions. But actually, within that, there's vast heterogeneity. So I think there's some things I'd be much more suspicious about. If somebody comes and offers me completely automated interviewing and full emotion analysis, I'd be much more suspicious about that than, say, skills tests that only form part of a larger process. And finally, I think it's really important that it's not just a question of binary, either we automate or we stick with the current processes. I think there's also a lot of questions, involve your current recruiters, involve your current workforce, and think about what bits of the task can be automated. Which bits do we want to make sure the humans, as it were, stay in the loop? And actually thinking about the technology more as empowering existing recruitment strategies rather than completely chucking everything out is also really, really important. And then finally, I was going to talk about involving worker voice, but I think Mary's got that covered excellently.
I would agree. Asking people who are actually individually affected by these systems is key, and not only affected, but are perhaps marginalized by systems. So people you might not think to talk to at the outset.
Or who get empowered, right? Sorry, or who get empowered by it. I think that's really interesting. There's lots of studies on sort of human-computer interaction at that point, and how you can either make the decision-making much better overall, or if you get it wrong, you can make it much worse. And so I think making sure you get that first part is super important.
It is indeed. I want to move to audience questions. I'm conscious we only have a couple of minutes left, but if any members of the audience want to pop a question in the chat, we'd be happy to take it. We already have a few coming in. I think that's an excellent question from Louise. Do we need a new conversation about what good means in recruitment in order to make useful decisions about new tools? What might we add to such a discussion? Neil, I don't know if you have any thoughts about what constitutes good in recruitment and how that might translate to the evaluation of AI tools for all of the above principles we've discussed.
So my provocative answer is no. And it's no because actually there is a standard. I'm currently herding 3,300 REC members through our compliance test, which is a test against what we expect of them under our code. I think that stuff has to matter more. And this is where I'm going to fairly obviously throw the ball over the fence, which is clients who are working with recruitment businesses and when working on their own are going to have to appreciate that recruitment is a human and professional process, which will be digitally enabled. It is not going to be an entirely digitized process. And anyone who thinks that is a fool. because you will end up baking things into your business that you don't want. So in terms of Louise's question, the real answer is sort of, because I think there are things opening up that we will need to apply our existing codes to change. But really, it's a mindset change of this is a human process, which the technology helps us with, because we're dealing with human beings. Comes back to my first point about the Treaty of Versailles. Labour is not a commodity.
That makes a lot of sense, Neil. I'm seeing now that we just have 1 minute left, so I may actually take the opportunity to end there and wrap up and thank everyone who's come out today, as well as our wonderful panelists for contributing your perspectives. I think the point you raised at the end, Neil, about human involvement will always be key, and the need to also plug in and build upon existing compliance and norms within HR and recruitment is so important. So thank you for raising that. Thank you to all so much for coming, and have a wonderful rest of the conference. Also, feel free to keep in touch with CDEI if this is of interest to you. Thank you so much. Over to you, Sammy.